Well, Discovery Church, good morning. How are you? So good to see you. You know, when I get on a plane from Nashville to Orlando, it feels like I am coming home when I get to hang out with you for a weekend. So thanks so much for having me back. And in Nashville today, we're supposed to get 7 inches of snow. We don't get snow very often, so I might skip my afternoon flight back and hang out with you guys for a couple of days. So, you all are in this series, Revealing Jesus, jumping into Revelation, and I'm thrilled on the heels of what Don did last Sunday to be able to continue to help propel you forward as you jump in to these 7 letters to these 7 churches recorded in Revelation 2 and 3. If I started a correspondence with you, or a communication, and I just said this, in the days of Martin Luther King Jr., or in the days of 9/11, or in the days of COVID-19, or whatever number we're up to at this point, not much else would need to be said, right? Because you understand the historical context connected to those events. Either you have studied those, or you've lived through those, or we're all living in the midst of this latter one right now. There's not much else that would need to be said. The same is true for the letter of Revelation, or what we call the book of Revelation. There is a historical context connected to it. Now, when most people hear Revelation, they immediately think end times. Now, are there end times aspects to the book of Revelation? Yes, there is, but Revelation is much more than just that. And here's my contention. Revelation had to be understood when it was received. That when these 7 churches received Revelation, it had to make sense to them. Because what happens, though, is for many of us as we engage with Revelation and we never stop to consider what does Revelation actually mean to the people to whom the book was actually written to, and how do we take that and then appropriately understand Revelation for our day today. So what's that historical context? Well, that's precisely what we're going to be tackling in this teaching today. And I want to do the teaching in 3 parts. Part 1 is going to be John, the writer of Revelation. Who is John? What do we need to know? The second part is Domitian, who is likely the emperor behind the book of Revelation. And then I want to conclude by looking specifically at the 7 letters and just providing a framework for those. And then to kind of tie all of this up, I'm just going to leave you with an illustration, an idea that I hope you will carry through as you navigate these letters over the next number of weeks that you're engaging it as a church. So does that sound good? All right, so that's what we're going to do. So let's start with John. Early church tradition indicates that John the disciple is the writer of Revelation. We know that it's John in Revelation. The question has been in scholarship, which John? Is it not John the disciple? Is it someone else? A minority view is that it's a different John. The majority view in the camp that I'm in, it makes the most sense by far, at least to me, is that John the disciple is the writer of Revelation. So what do we know about John the disciple? Well, most of you will know that John is one of the earliest disciples who was called, and he was, in fact, a fisherman. So here is an image of a couple of guys in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, And Jesus will call Peter and Andrew, pair of brothers, and then as well as James and John. So what's cool is that John is in Jesus's discipleship group with his brother. Now on a map here, the Sea of Galilee is on the northern end of Israel, and at the northern end of the actual Sea of Galilee are these cities Capernaum, Bethsaida. Now Jesus calls them around Capernaum, but notice this passage from John 1:44. It says that Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. And so Bethsaida was on that northeast side around the Sea of Galilee. Now, it doesn't tell us that's where John is from, but Peter and Andrew are from there. And we know that Peter and Andrew and James and John are working together in the fishing industry. So if that's where John is from, it's a little village. He's from a very small town. Now, John is probably the youngest of all of the disciples. And I'm just going to posit a birth year for John being 10 AD. That's going to be kind of our anchor point this morning. Jesus' ministry began in about 27 AD, and Jesus is calling disciples, and what we know of rabbis and disciples is that disciples were typically in their teenage years. So John is probably mid-teens when he is called. So we're just going to use kind of 10 AD as an anchor date. John is really fast, all right? How do we know that? John chapter 20, it's the resurrection scene, or right before the resurrection, at least as far as them to understand what has happened with the empty tomb. And John tells us multiple times in his gospel that he outran Peter to get to the tomb. And he says it multiple times. It's hilarious. All right, so apparently John has got some quick legs on him. John, along with his brother James and Peter, are part of what we call the inner three disciples. So Jesus chooses 12 disciples, and among those 12, there are 3 inner disciples, and John is one of them. And that means that at least for 3 significant events in Jesus' life and ministry recorded in the Gospels, those 3 got to experience it. The other 9 did not. One of those events was the Transfiguration. All right, and John is part of the inner 3. John calls himself in his Gospel of John the disciple whom Jesus loved. Wonder what the other disciples thought about that one, right? He's like, I'm the one Jesus loves. I'm not sure about the rest of you. Well, John, who is writing the Gospel of John as well, is engaging in the ancient practice of humility as an author, where you don't bring attention to yourself in your own work. And so the idea in this is that ancient writers in humility would talk about themselves in the third person, or they would have some kind of title for themselves. And John's is the disciple whom Jesus loved, which I just find great and ironic and cool and unique. And here's why. When we meet John in the Gospels, he's got a temper. Jesus calls him and his brother the sons of thunder. That word thunder is connected to the word that means enraged. At one point, they're going through Samaria. They're upset with what's going on, and they go, Jesus, let's just call down fire from heaven on these people. Jesus is like, John, I think we need to have a conversation. This doesn't jive with my whole love your enemy kind of thing. And I believe that what happened is that John learned to fully embrace the love from Jesus, and it transformed him into somebody who knew how to love. Because more than 80 times in his writing, he uses the word love. And it's just really cool, this transformation that takes place with John. John is the one who's sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper. John is also the one who was the only disciple who was at the cross when Jesus is being crucified. And it's actually at that scene that helps us to understand something else about John that you may or may not know. And here's the possibility that Jesus and John are cousins. Let me show you from the text. This is from Matthew chapter 27, verse 56. Matthew records who is at the cross. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. James and John's father is Zebedee. That's crystal clear in the text. John's mom is at the cross. Now, use that passage in connection to what John records when he's retelling the story at the cross, and we get this in John 19. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, meaning Jesus' mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, some think that because John is engaging in that posture of humility, that he's not drawing attention to his mother who is at the cross. And the idea is that his mother is actually, in John's reference, his mother's sister, meaning Mary's sister. Now, we don't know that for certain, but you put those two passages together, and all of a sudden you go, wait a minute. Jesus and John may actually be cousins, which also helps us to understand in the next couple of verses where Jesus is almost expired on the cross. And at the very end, he says to his mother, "Mother, behold your son," talking to John, "John, behold your mother," which means Jesus entrusted John with caring for his mother after he died. That's remarkable because Jesus has brothers and sisters. They're in the text. But they think he is a farce and not the Son of God, not the Messiah, not all of that. And so Jesus entrusts John with the care of his mother. That's a task. Don't mess that one up, right? And so there's this really unique thing going on with Jesus and John. Now, Jesus dies, he's resurrected. 40 days later, he ascends back to heaven. And then we've got the book of Acts. And in Acts, we get some stories about John, but then after Acts 8, we don't hear about John. But what we do have is that the Apostle Paul, after his first missionary journey, he's writing what many believe is his very first letter, the letter of Galatians. He's recounting how he made a trip to Jerusalem. And in Galatians 2, notice what Paul writes. He says, James, Cephas, talking about Peter, and John, this is our John, those esteemed as pillars. And then it goes on from there. But he says John is a pillar in the church of Jerusalem. And what we know about John is John really becomes like the first elder statesman of the church. And as a disciple, he then moves into a leadership role for the church centered in Jerusalem. Now, what's sad is that the very first disciple to be murdered, to be martyred, was his brother. And you also get that in the book of Acts. And John is going to be in Jerusalem for some time. Now, we don't know the exact timeline, but here's what seems to make most sense, is that when Jesus was with his disciples, there is one time where he's talking to them, and he says, hey, when you start hearing about rumors of war, get out of here, flee. And when people read that in the Gospels, they go, oh, Jesus is talking about the end times. He's not talking about the end times. He's talking about the besiegement and destruction of Jerusalem that was going to happen in 70 AD when the temple was going to get burned to the ground. That first great Jewish revolt that culminated with that moment began in 66 AD. And it's during this time, sometime in these first probably couple years once the revolt starts, because once that revolt starts, everything starts to get to be like hot, and the centering of all the Roman legion attention is in the northern part of the country of Israel, and then they just move south towards Jerusalem. Is that it is believed that at this time, John leaves Jerusalem with his family, extended family, disciples, people that he's in community with, and they go and they move to the western part of what is present-day Turkey. Let me show you on a map here where this is. You have Asia Minor here, which is present-day Turkey. Now, this is super confusing, all right? The whole area was called Asia Minor, but the very western part of Asia Minor was the Roman province of Asia, okay? I know, it doesn't seem to make any sense, but that's what's going on. And it's there on the western side that you have the great city of Ephesus, and this is where John ends up. Now, let's throw up here an image of Ephesus so you can get an idea of the layout of the archaeological area and site today. So up on the left part of the picture is the Aegean coast. During the first century, and after that, You have the Aegean comes all the way up to the city because it's a harbor city, but due to the silting of the Cayster River, it has pushed the water 3 miles away from the site today. But this is a harbor city, and in the second half of the first century AD, it became the capital city of the Roman province of Asia, the leading city of the area. Now, when you look across here, and let's kind of zoom in a little bit on the right side of the image, you can begin to get a layout of what the city looks like today. Minimum of 250,000 people. And here, if you were to go kind of on the backside of those hills and shoot here towards us, this is the image that you would get to show you an archaeological rendering of, or an artist rendering of the archaeological site. And it is here where more people invested in the city of Ephesus than any other city in the Bible aside from Jerusalem. This is where Paul spent 3 years during his third missionary journey. People are pouring into Ephesus left and right. But if John shows up in Ephesus in the late 60s, Peter and Paul have just been martyred in Rome under Nero. And because Paul had invested so much in Ephesus, there is now a leadership vacuum that has happened there, and it appears to be that John fills in that leadership vacuum. And John is going to be here. If he gets here in the late 60s, he's going to be here for at least 3 decades, pouring into the people who are here. And John is ministering as the chief shepherd of all these little house churches, these little Jesus communities within the city itself. He is writing his Gospel of John. He is most likely writing the 3 epistles that bear his name, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are at the end of our New Testament. And then something happens in Ephesus that changes the trajectory of John's life. He's going to eventually get exiled. Now, what we do know from writers is that after, and I'll walk you through that story in a moment, John is going to then return to Ephesus, and he's going to die in Ephesus. In fact, if you go behind these 2 hills, which are known as Mount Pion, and you go to the northeast onto the hill of Ayasaluk, you come to this structure right here. This is called the Basilica of St. John. This was constructed in the beginning, or constructed in the 4th century AD, had some additional building on and whatnot. But if you go through that entrance right there, you will see this image off to your right. It's the tomb of John the disciple. It's in the foreground here. It's underneath that stone slab. And John was buried in Ephesus. So this is the life of John. We'll return to that in just a little bit, but now let me draw you into what is going on with the emperor who is likely on the throne during Revelation. So let me just show you a visual of the first 11 emperors of the Roman Empire. Isn't that spectacular, by the way, these pictures? It brings them to life. A number of artists are using artificial intelligence as well as Photoshop to take the sculptures that have been found from the ancient world and reconstruct what these emperors look like, because the statues of these emperors are the same wherever you find them. So you can go to a museum in Rome and Caesar Augustus looks like Caesar Augustus in the museum in Rome as you would in the museum in Athens, as you would in the museum in Ephesus. And so you've got this really cool thing that's coming on, happening from an artist rendering perspective of the emperors. Now, the very first emperor was Caesar Augustus. And Caesar Augustus ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. If John was born in 10 AD, John has lived through all 11 emperors who are on the throne during the New Testament time. Like, he has seen it all. And he has seen what has happened in the midst of all of these emperors. Caesar Augustus was like the Renaissance emperor for Rome. He was the standard that every Roman emperor sought to meet. And here's the thing about Caesar Augustus. He ruled for a long time, and he did a really great job by Roman standards. Then you have Tiberius, and then Tiberius is an okay ruler, but then he abrogates his responsibilities for the last 10 years of his reign. He resided to the island of Capri on the Bay of Naples, where he died of old age. Caesar Augustus died of old age, Tiberius died of old age, and then a very interesting trend started to happen. Caligula comes to the throne. The dude is a nut. Absolute nut job. Assassinated. Claudius, assassinated. Nero commits suicide because he knew he was going to be assassinated. Galba, assassinated. Odo committed suicide because he lost a major battle. Vitellius, assassinated. And then in 69 AD, Vespasian will rule for 10 years, and he's the first really good emperor since Caesar Augustus. The problem was that after 10 years, he died of an illness, and he died at the age of 69. And the emperorship fell to his son, Titus. And Titus, like his father, was a great emperor. But after 2 years, he fell ill and died at the age of 41. And his little brother that nobody wanted on the throne is a guy by the name of Domitian, who is actually made emperor of Rome. And Domitian is believed to be the emperor that is happening behind Revelation. Now, that's the majority view. The minority view is that it's actually Nero. Nero was the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. It started with the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. But the thing about Nero is that his persecution was limited to Rome. Domitian's persecution of Christians and other people extended way beyond Rome. Now, Domitian, when he first came to the throne in 81, okay, and he's going to go from 81 to 96. Most people put Revelation 93, 94, 95, somewhere right in there. And Domitian comes to the throne, and initially, he's actually a good emperor. Like, he follows in the footsteps of his father and his older brother, but the longer that he's on the throne, the more power he has, the bigger his ego got. And when we have this phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, that is absolutely what happened with Domitian. And with that power came paranoia. Not unlike what happened with Herod the Great and why he murdered all the baby boys around the time when Jesus was born. Now, when Domitian, when Domitian is amassing and starting to really realize what his power can do, his paranoia started to go through the roof. It got so bad that he had the palace walls of his house polished, so that as he walked through, he'd be able to see the reflection of anyone who might come up from behind him and assassinate him. He was concerned, even in his own palace, that his own house guard was going to take him out. And they did in 96. All right? But he was that concerned. And the thing about Domitian is that he persecuted people. Notice what Eusebius writes. And as we do this, let me first of all show you. Here's a picture of Domitian that another artist has done as well. That'll kind of give you a rendering here. This is the guy. And notice what Eusebius says this guy is doing from this inscription right here. Let's go to that Eusebius quote, please. With terrible cruelty, Domitian put to death without trial great numbers of men at Rome who were distinguished by family and career, and without cause banished many other notables and confiscated their property. Finally, he showed himself Nero's successor in hostility to God. Eusebius is a Christian writer. He was the second to organize a persecution against us, the Christians, though his father Vespasian had no such evil plans. So Domitian persecuted his own people. Now imagine people that he really didn't like, i.e. the Christians. And he unleashed a persecution upon the Christians. Now, when he was assassinated in 98 or 96 AD, the Roman Senate, with great joy, pronounced upon him after his assassination, damnatio memoriae. It's a Latin phrase that means damnation of memory, Rome was so ashamed that he had been an emperor that they sought to blot out his name from all of the records. And so all the statues that bore his name, they scratched off. Literally, you can walk down the street of Ephesus today, and I was just there in September, and you can see this on different plaques. And his name has been completely scratched out because they despised Domitian. And yet, this is the guy who is on the throne at the time of Revelation. Now, one other piece I want to give you about Domitian and how his story intersects with John's story is that when these Roman emperors came to the throne, they chose one city within the empire, and it all happened to be, by the way, usually in the Roman province of Asia, where they would have a temple constructed to their worship. It's called an emperor worship temple. And it became the hot spot of worship for that emperor, and that city bore the honor of having that temple. Guess which city Domitian chose for his temple? Ephesus. If we go back to our shot of Ephesus, on the very, very right side, you can kind of see that big square with another small theater that's attached to it. Here is what that is actually a little closer up. This is what is called the State Agora. And on the bottom side of this image, he had constructed this giant vaulted system that had a platform on top. This was the foundation for his temple. He didn't have enough real estate in Ephesus to make it as big as he wanted it to be. So he created this vault system so he could build a platform, and the length of the platform was the length of a football field, and the width was half of a football field, and he stuck this on top of that platform. A monster temple, and there was a colossal statue of himself, 15 feet tall. You can see him with his left arm raised high in the air, and you go, that's a great artist rendering. Yeah, it's an artist rendering based on what's been found. This is in the Ephesus Museum. That guy right there is 6'1". Domitian's got a big head, right? And it was there where Domitian put the center of worship to him as a divine human ruler on earth. Writers talk about how he required people to call him Lord and God. And John is pastoring here where a monster temple has been erected to the hot spot in the entire Roman Empire, to Domitian. And because we know that within a Roman household, if you were within the Roman Empire, the male head of the household, called the paterfamilias, every year, at least once a year, would go and on behalf of his entire family would offer incense and declare Caesar is Lord. John would not do that. Jesus is Lord. And as a result of that, John became a political and religious enemy of the state. And what Tacitus tells us is such people were exiled to small islands where they were subjected to harsh labors, physical beatings, a miserable experience, and John is exiled to Patmos. Here is a map to show you where Patmos is. Patmos is 55 miles to the southwest of Ephesus, and if you were to go to Patmos today, here's what you would see. It's a small island, 7.5 miles long, 6 miles wide. You can walk the length of the island in a few hours. And it is here where the elderly John has been exiled. And this is also the setting for where he received revelation. And with that in mind, I'd like to invite you to please stand. And if you can't physically stand, stand in your hearts. But I'd love to invite you to stand for those of you who are at Alafaya and Winter Garden, watching online if you're in your living room. If you're driving, just keep driving, all right? And we're not going to put these verses up on the side screens. Because I want you to imagine that 2,000 years ago, you were a resident of one of these 7 cities that are identified here in Revelation 1 and then 2 and 3, and listening to this in the context of what you know. Because, spoiler alert, all 7 churches are in the Roman province of Asia. This is where the hotspot of Domitian worship is happening. And I want you to listen to what happens starting in verse 9. Now, there are 8 verses before this. It is the prologue as well as the greeting. Read that sometime in the next day or two. But listen to what John writes about what happened while he is on Patmos, probably in his 80s, which is, by the way, incredibly ancient for that day. 55 to 60 was your normal life expectancy. He's somewhere in his 80s, and he's the only disciple of the 12 that actually dies a natural death, okay? He's the last of them. He's seen them all martyred, murdered. He's hearing the propaganda of the empire. Domitian is calling himself Lord and God. Rome is saying we're the hope of the entire world. And while he is on Patmos, in the midst of his own persecution, he gets a vision. Listen to these words. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, here's Jesus speaking, write on a scroll what you see, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand, he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all of its brilliance. Can you imagine this scene for John? John then says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And then it jumps right into the 7 letters to those 7 churches. The word of the Lord. All right, thanks be to God. You may be seated. Thank you for standing in the reading and honor of God's word. So John gets this vision of these 7 churches that he is supposed to write these letters to. And by the way, he knows these cities. If we go back to our map here, you'll see that Asia Minor, again, the very western side was called Asia, the Roman province. And here's the thing. Outside of Italy, the most important region to the entire Roman Empire is the Roman province of Asia. Here on our next map, these are the 7 most significant cities in the most significant province in the entire Roman Empire. And it's the 7 churches are in these 7 cities. And Jesus is speaking in to these churches. Now, practically speaking, when it says, send the letters to these 7 churches, it's in the order of the first century mail route. So John's going to send a messenger with, by the way, all 7 churches got all of Revelation. That's Revelation 1 through Revelation 22. There's 7 copies of Revelation, and a messenger is dropping them off at each of these cities. Now, when I say the church or we read about the church, don't think church building like Discovery Church. Think something more like this right here. This is a villa that was uncovered in the excavations in Ephesus. The church buildings do not exist in the first century. Why? Christianity isn't a legal religion. So they're meeting in homes. They're meeting in villas of wealthy people that could bring in enough people to be the church in there. And there's not just one, there's probably 10, 15, 20 house churches going on all around the city. And they're meeting during the middle of the night under the cover of darkness because their religion is not allowed. And you are in the city of Ephesus, the hot spot of emperor worship to Domitian. So much so, it's why John is almost certainly exiled for this reason. See, friends, there is a historical context and setting to Revelation. And the purpose of the entire book of Revelation is this: Jesus Christ is still on the throne. That in the midst of the Roman Empire, where they were proclaiming that they were the salvation of the world, and that on the throne is the emperor who makes this all go round, Jesus goes, listen, I know you are hearing the propaganda that Caesar is Lord and God. I'm actually Lord and God. Like, dude after dude after dude, they all died and nobody rose from the grave. And Domitian is going to get taken out in his own palace. But Jesus says, I am the first and the last. I've died and I came back to life again. I hold the keys to life and death. I was the one who conquered death. I am the one who rules and reigns supreme. And Jesus is speaking into a situation of persecution among the seven churches to go, listen, I know you are going through a living hell on earth, but don't for a moment think that I'm somehow not on the throne. And I am working in the midst of your situation. See, the problem when we get to Revelation and we think it's all end times, we lose the idea that this had to make sense to the people when they received it. It wasn't like John said to his messenger who was going to deliver these to the seven churches, hey, show up in the individual city and say, hey, I know you're going through horrific circumstances, but here is a letter from John, from Jesus, but it's not going to make sense for 2,000 years, but just kind of hang on to it. And there's so much going on in Revelation as a whole. It would probably take well over a year to tackle that sucker. You're going to be jumping into these seven churches. And here's what Jesus is doing, because it's so absolutely cool. And this is where I want to bring into our third part, just to give you an overview of what you're going to engage over these next number of weeks. If this is happening in the early to mid 90s, it means the church has had 6 decades to figure out what it means to be the church post the resurrection. And there are some things that they have gotten right, and there are some things that they have gotten wrong. And Jesus has a letter for each of the 7 churches. Now, here's what's really fascinating about this, is that what one church got a letter from Jesus, the other 6 churches got to read it as well. Because all 7 churches got all of Revelation. Nothing got swept underneath the carpet. What was said to one was said to the others. And Jesus will open up these letters and he will say to the angel of the church in Ephesus, or to the angel of the church in Smyrna, or to the angel of the church in, you get that. That angel seems to be the ethos of the community. There's a lot of textual things you got to do to kind of string that together. But when he says to the angel of the church, if he's saying to the essence of who you are as a community, I have some words for you. And Jesus will identify himself with some kind of a title that connects in to their unique situation as a city. It's super cool. So like if Jesus was writing Discovery at church, he'd probably reference Walt Disney somehow, okay? And then he says, I know your deeds. And he's going to preface what he says next with, I know your deeds. And the reason why is because what you believe gets played out in what you do. You can say you believe whatever you believe, but the proof is in what's going on in your actions. And so he says, I know your deeds. And then when he addresses their deeds, it falls into two camps. One side of it is that there are times where he's going to praise them for their deeds, and then at other times he's going to rebuke them because of their deeds. And you're going to see this pattern throughout the letters. And after he has addressed what they've done well or what they haven't done well, he then is going to offer them up a reward, which, by the way, is connected with being with him for eternity. It's all these different ways of linking it to you get to be with me. And then he ends every letter, or at least in 3 cases, the reward comes after, and the other 4 cases, the reward comes before this. But then there's this final line that goes like this: whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Okay, so here's what's cool about that. What was said to one church is instructed to all the churches to heed, even though each church got their own individual letter. But this phrase, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches, isn't new language in the Bible. Jesus is drawing upon a long tradition of this phrase of having ears to hear. It starts in Isaiah. So you've got the prophet Isaiah talks about this in Isaiah 6. It goes into Jeremiah, and then it also goes into Ezekiel. And I want to show you one passage in Ezekiel because it captures the context for how this phrase is used. Notice this from Ezekiel 12:2, God is speaking. Son of man, he's speaking to Ezekiel, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see, but do not see, and ears to hear, but do not hear, for they are a rebellious people. So the idea of referencing have ears to hear is in a context to say, don't have a hard heart, don't be rebellious. What Jesus does at the end of each of these letters, after he's addressed their deeds, he says, I'm instructing you on how I want you to live and act in the world. Don't be rebellious to my words. Heed them. And as you all are in the series of revealing Jesus, and as Don talked last week, what is a great church? A great church is one who reveals Jesus for who he really is. But here's the contention. If you are going to reveal Jesus, then the church must reflect what Jesus values. Jesus wants to be represented well in the world today. And so when Jesus is instructing them, he's praising them and he's rebuking them to ensure that they're living in tune to representing him well in the world. And it's not just for God's glory and for the glory of Jesus Christ to go forth in the world. It's for our good, because when we live in tune to God's will and way in the world, we flourish even in the midst of hard circumstances. And this is what Jesus is doing. And so he's got some hard words for these churches. But what he says in Laodicea letter, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. It's always in the context of love that Jesus is going to praise us because we need to be encouraged. And Jesus is going to rebuke us. He's going to challenge us because that's how we grow. That's how we get back on track. And these 7 letters were a recalibration for these churches to get back at what Jesus values and what it means to be the compelling force for good in the world that the local church was always designed to be. And this is what these letters are all about. And as you engage these letters, you're going to engage this as the church of discovery. Because here's what I can tell you, is that these letters are as relevant to the church today as they were 2,000 years ago when Jesus gave John this vision on Patmos. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. Y'all as a church might get your bell rung. There might be times where you're talking about Jesus is addressing what the church in Sardis is doing or the church in Laodicea, and you may have to step back and go, oh no, we're kind of in that boat. And to be honest and to acknowledge, we're not doing this well. And we got to get back to what Jesus values. And in the same token, I want you to hear for those words of encouragement. Because I know what's going on in these letters and I know what's going on here, there's going to be so much encouragement you're going to get over these next number of weeks. And we need both. And Jesus gives us both of them in love. So as you engage these letters, think about it as a church. I also want you to think about it as your own marriage. If you are married, think about this in terms of what would Jesus be speaking into your marriage about? And I also want you to think about this in terms of just your own walk as a follower of Jesus, seeking to be a light in a very dark world. What is Jesus saying to you? And don't be rebellious to what he's revealing, because he wants you to reflect him in the world. Let me just conclude with just an illustration that I hope will just kind of stick with you throughout this series. Here is an image of my family. My wife, Shallon, and I have been married for 18 years, and we've got 4 kids, Denyon, Araya, Calix is next to me, and then our little guy, Zyler. And my son, Denyon, is 14 years old. He's an 8th grader. In September, I went to Turkey for 2 weeks. I left, I was taller. I came back and I wasn't. And he was so proud, as he should be. But I said, hey, buddy, I kind of set you a low standard, all right? But my son, Denyon, and my daughter, Araya, are both in basketball season with their middle school. Denyon's an 8th grader, Araya is a 6th grader. And actually, my 2 younger ones as well, Calix and Zyler, are also in basketball. They're in rec basketball. And my wife, Shallon, and I, we co-coach them together, which is an absolute blast. And because you all don't have a Saturday night service, I actually got to coach my 2 younger kids yesterday with my wife. And then after the second game, went right to the airport and got on a plane and came down here. All right, so that was fun for me to be able to do. And it was a little bit unnerving this morning because I was actually walking through the lobby, and as I'm walking through, a guy says, hey, Brad, come over here real quick. And I said, okay, and he pulls out his phone, and he holds up a picture of me at the gym I was coaching at with me in the gym from last night. One of his friends was at the game. He says, hey, just be reminded, you never know who's watching. Always smile. I was like, oh man, all right. It's a good reminder, good reminder. And, but this is something that we do as a family, is my son, Denyon, and my daughter, Araya, when they come out of the locker room, the very first thing that we say to them, regardless of what happened in the game, we love you and we're proud of you. And we just let that sit. And then what we do is when we get in the car, and sometimes we're together as a family, and other times because, you know, my son's in 8th grade and my daughter's in 6th grade and they're playing in different places, is that we get one-on-one time with them as we drive home. And when we get in the car, the very first question that is asked from my wife or from myself is, hey, what do you think you did well today? And they just start rattling it off, and we have a discussion about that. And then we say, what didn't go well today? And what needs to be done in order to do that better? Because here's the thing. Without challenge, without rebuke, we don't grow. Without encouragement, we become discouraged. We need both in order to thrive. And what these 7 letters for you as you engage them in this series are all about is like jumping in the car and having a chat with God and allowing him to speak in to what's going well and what needs to be corrected for his glory and for our good. Amen? So may you engage these letters with open eyes and open ears and a soft heart. And that's precisely what I want to pray over you right now. So God, we love and we bless you and we thank you for today and for the incredible privilege that has been ours to set Revelation in its context. That as we engage the writings of John, the life of John, Revelation, that God, we would just take this context with us and to be able to see more of what's going on in the words that you gave. God, as this amazing community digs into these 7 letters to these 7 churches, I pray, God, that you would speak clearly words of praise and words of challenge, and that this community would be soft to what you are going to do. And that as we think about this in terms of a church, as we think about this in terms of just our relationships, our marriage, our own individual walk with you, Jesus, God, may we have eyes to see, ears to hear, and soft hearts to what you're going to say. May we not be rebellious. May we be faithful as we seek to reveal you in the world and reflect what you value. God, we love you, we bless you, and everyone part of the Discovery community said, amen.